All right, so just really quickly in chapter 25, since we didn't get to talk too much about the last few verses there, what is going on? What's the big thing that happened in 25? Big events.
Birthright sold.
Birthright
sold.
The last part of it definitely is Esau sells his birthright to Jacob. Now, is that a big deal or a little deal? It's a big deal. And usually, if you're going to sell something of great value, you expect something of great price for it. What did he sell this very valuable thing for? Bowl of soup, basically, right? A bowl of soup is what he sold it for. How is Esau described because of that in these verses right here?
A profaner.
A profaner. Again, it's a word we don't use a ton. Does it actually say it in this passage? Actually, in the Hebrews, is referred to as that. It's in Hebrews, right? Because here it just says he despised his birthright, verse 34. But if you go look at Hebrews chapter 12, verse 6, it calls him a profane person. So chapter 11, Hebrews is all the chapter of all the really faithful people. You get to 12 and it brings up Esau and calls him a profane person. And we talked a little bit about what does the word profane mean. We use it in profanity. What does it mean at its base? To take something special and treat it as common. It's exactly what he did with his birthright. We also talked briefly about how can we be profane. We don't want to be profane, but how can we be profane? God's name in vain. Again, the definition of profanity, taking something very special, God, and then using it in a common slang way. Even that's what we talk about people, it's really common for kids, or it's not kids, for everybody to say, I don't want to say it, oh my God, just in passing. That is the definition of profanity, because you're taking something that's very special and just using it as a slang type saying. We should not be doing that. I know sometimes people have habits with things. We all need to watch ourselves, all need to work on stuff like that. But again, profanity.
And most people don't understand that.
And most people have no concept, right? It doesn't really mean anything. Even going back to the Old Testament times, and Cody can correct me, they made different names for God because they didn't even want to say God's name. It was so special, so highly revered, that they didn't want to say the real name for God, so they made up other names to refer to God. And then you look how far we have come now, where again, actually taking God's name and just using it in a trite way. So this is something we should watch and be aware of.
Well, it's not even just saying that; it's the abbreviations as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same thing.
Yep. We got to watch what we're doing. We should be mindful of the words we use as best we can. Anything else in chapter 25?
Abraham died.
Abraham did die. The big thing, right? That was a big thing, right? The patriarch died in chapter 25.
Even though he had a lot of other children, Isaac got everything because he was the child of promise.
That's exactly right. Abraham did everything he could to put things in Isaac's favor because he knew the promise was going to come through him. He understood that. And he even did things that were painful to him. We talked a little bit about Ishmael and sending him away and how much that pained him. But still, he did what he could to establish the promises that were going to come through Isaac. And we did talk about what the birthright was, right? The double portion that it entailed. We did talk about that. It was actually going to, Esau actually had coming to him a double portion, two parts of the inheritance. And to him, I'll take a bowl of soup. And his reasoning was just bad, right? He said, if I die, I'm not going to get it anyway, because he thought he was going to die. So he just takes food instead. Again.
God told Rebecca she had two nations in her womb, and that the older would serve the younger.
That's right.
That came true with that severing of the birthright.
Right. We talked about that. We also talked about how the two nations being in her womb. We talked about predestination a little bit. We talked about how denominational people refer to Romans chapter 9, about how they will use that chapter to talk about individual predestination to heaven or hell. That is not what it's talking about. The whole context of Romans 9, 10, 11 is about how God had chosen Israel, despite of their faults, to be the nation he was going to use to bring about his son. Again, God didn't choose perfect people, right? Was Abraham, as good as he was he perfect? No, he was not. Was Isaac perfect? No, he was. Was Jacob perfect? Far from it. His name means supplanter, right? He's wheeling and dealing, trying to take his brother's birthright for a bowl of soup. And then he's going to work with his mom later on to deceive his father to ensure he steals that birthright. So again, not perfect people, but God chose this nation to bring about salvation. This is way off the subject. I wasn't going to talk about this. But again, it's so critical to when we talk with denominational people today. Romans 9, 10, and 11 is not talking about individual salvation. Paul is answering the charge because what was the Jews in the New Testament big hang-up? What did they understand about Christ? What did they understand about Christianity?
Earthly kingdom versus heavenly kingdom.
Sir?
Earthly kingdom versus heavenly kingdom.
That was one of the things that they couldn't, that's true, but they couldn't get around, huh?
Gentile versus.
They couldn't get around the Gentiles. They thought they were the chosen people regardless. They couldn't get around the idea that the Gentiles were going to be accepted and that not,
They were despised not.
huh?
They were despised not.
There was envy, which we're going to talk about here, that creates problems and hatred. They didn't understand it. They thought no matter what they did, they were going to be selected. And that was kind of fit in with, if you look at the prophecies in the Old Testament. And there's actually a verse in Romans where Paul says, but not all Israel is Israel. And what he was saying, he goes, the national part has nothing to do with it. It's the faithful people that are going to be saved, right? And so if the Jews would be faithful to Christianity and do what was required, they'd be saved. If the Gentiles did what was required, they were going to be saved. They didn't get that. And that's what Paul was trying to explain in Romans 9, 10, and 11. And people get that all discombobulated and again, and want to apply it to individuals, and they come up with predestination. God picks people to go to heaven and God picks people to go to hell, and that's just not the case.
Also on the lines of predestination, they come up with that with Jacob and Esau. Esau predestined for failure, right?
Right.
But you have the prophet Obadiah, who preaches to the Edomites for the descendants, the nation that comes from Esau.
Right.
And he concludes his preaching with talking about the kingdom of God that's going to come and their invitation into it.
Right.
And so there's a whole invitation being offered to the whole people. Why would that be the case?
If they were predestined to be
Right.
to go eternally, right? Actually, even you get to Romans chapter 11, it talks about belief and obedience being necessary. Again, if God is pre-selecting for individuals for eternal salvation, there's supposed to be no responsibility on the individual. But Romans chapter 11 definitely talks about that. So we'll get more into that later, but that's kind of, since it's involves what we're studying about here, being referred back in history, I wanted us to bring that up. If you got any questions, ask away. Okay, chapter 26. Let's see if we can go faster now. Someone read verses 1 through 5.
There was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws.
There you go, man. Thank you, Rick. Who gets brought up in verse 1? What king? Abimelech. Now, when I read this, because we just read about Abimelech chapter-wise not too long ago, right? Who was Abimelech dealing with a few chapters back? Abraham. And so when I see that you see a name, and I see a name like this, I'm like, oh, this is the same guy. Well, there's some contextual stuff that's going to bring this into question. If it is the same guy, how old is Abimelech? Way old. Because how old was Abraham when he died? 175. So if Abimelech was contemporary with Abraham, and now Abimelech's dealing with his son here later on, Abimelech's way old. We probably won't take the time to read this morning, but you can write down if you want Psalms chapter 34. In 1 Samuel, oh man, I don't know if I wrote down this chapter. I think I wrote down the verses. That's a big mistake. 1 Samuel did chapter 21, verses 10 through 15. I got to go correct that in my notes. That is David talking about a king Abimelech. In chapter 34, same instance talked about in 1 Samuel, they call him Achish, another name for it. So it appears, and that would be, way, way later, right? So it appears that Abimelech is a name for the king. Much like Pharaoh is a name for the king of Egypt, it seems like it's a title almost, not necessarily a person, because this would most necessarily be a different person more than likely just due to the age. That makes sense? So Psalm 34, 1 Samuel 21, verses 10 through 15. What happens in the rest of those verses, 2 through 4? What is being reiterated there?
He's not going to go to Egypt, and promises will be reinstated.
Yeah, he tells him, God is very, like I said, when God talked to the people directly like that, he was very specific, right? There wasn't ambiguity. People talk about God talking to them today, and you're like, how do you know? Oh, I feel. Oh, I think. God says, don't go to Egypt. So the question is asked, Isaac, how do you know to go to Egypt? That's what God said. Just plain and simple, don't go, right? But the promise is being reiterated. The promise that was given to Abraham that through him all nations would be blessed is now being reiterated to Isaac. Again, you think about God. Why do you think God didn't want Isaac to go to Egypt?
Because it went down, to go there yet.
Well, I mean, he's been very concerned about where his people went. Where Abraham said, hey, don't take my son back to my home country. Don't pick a wife from this country. Very concerned again about where you're at. We talked about again the concern as parents and grandparents we have for our kids and grandkids about where are you going to go to school, where are you going to live, who are you going to marry. All those concerns, because we're concerned about them being faithful, right? So those are the concerns we have that we try to transfer to our children, and this is God doing that with his children, right? Trying to do things where he ensures their faithfulness. What do you notice about verse 5? Right? So he obeyed. We're going to pick out two things here. I guess maybe I'm not asking the question in a good way. What is some of the reasons Isaac is receiving blessings from God? Because of Abraham. Because of what Abraham did.
But Abraham was such a good example to his son. And his son, in all indications, did the same.
Yes, sir, no doubt. But again, it gives me, it's not like guaranteed, it's not predestination, but God is definitely bestowing grace to Isaac because of how Abraham was. So we're always looking for motivation for how we want to, something that inspires us to live a better life, be better Christians. Sometimes people will do a certain thing, a level, if you will, for themselves, a certain amount of work. If I'm going to slack, I'm going to slack on myself, right? If I'm going to take it, I'm going to take it easy because I'm the one that's going to pay the price, right? I'm not going to study, I'm not going to work as hard, whatever it might be. Now, if it becomes like, okay, this is for your wife, or this is for your kids, or this is for your family, are you less inclined to slack on somebody else? Yeah. Maybe it's a motivation to do, maybe if I just do the best that I can, not only through your influence and through your example of living that way, but who knows? I'll say it that way. Perhaps God will extend some grace to your children. A type of encouragement. What else do we read again in verse 5? In regards to faith only. That's a bunch of nonsense, right? Turn back to Genesis again, a favorite verse of the denominationalist. Chapter 15, verse 6. What does it say there about Abraham? And this is actually quoted in Romans 4. Go ahead.
He continued counted in it to him for righteousness.
He believed in the Lord, talking about Abraham, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. That's referred back to in Romans chapter 4, verse 32. But here in verse 26, verse 5, how does it define belief, if you will? Because he obeyed my voice and kept my charge and my commandments and my statutes and my laws. People don't like this. Belief equals obedience. No ifs, ands, or buts. Disobedience equals unbelief. People can say, I believe in God all they want. But if they don't do what he says, they do not believe. Plain and simple. You have to do what he says. Any questions on that?
Through because of Abraham's belief and obedience, that was brought on into his descendant also Isaac. We talk about the blessings that Isaac received, because he was a righteous man also, but he was showing grace to Abraham because of what Abraham was and who he was. But if Isaac was not a righteous person, he would not have received it.
That's right. It doesn't. Trying to think what a good example is. You can do the best job you can as a parent and raise your kids in a godly home. Guess what? Your kids have freedom of choice, free moral agents. Now, you could have made, like we talked about, making the way as easy or as I hate to say hedging their bets, but trying to make it as good as possible for your kids to be a Christian. They can still go astray. They can still choose to do that. But again, you're doing everything in your power to make that choice easier on them, to make it more obvious for them. So that's what no doubt Abraham did for his son. Isaac's going to follow through, but again, Isaac could have chosen, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to go do whatever. And he could have made that choice. Okay, anything else? Let's read some more. Verse 6 through, let's go and read some more, 6 through 16.
So Isaac settled in Gerar. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, she is my sister. For he feared to say my wife, thinking, lest the men of the place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, she is your wife. How then could you say, she is my sister? Isaac said to him, because I thought, lest I die because of her. Abimelech said, what is this that you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death.
Go ahead and stop right there. Let's conclude this thought right here because it goes on to something else in the next few verses. Thank you, though. So what does Isaac do that Abraham, his father, did? Exact same thing. Exactly. And if Abimelech, again, if it is the same person, highly doubtful, it's the exact same person. It's the exact same country, exact same thing. Again, that's why I kind of believe this is not the same person, because you would have thought, if it was, he'd have like, what is wrong with you? This is anything your dad did. What are you doing to us? Why do y'all keep trying to lay a trap for us like this? So he goes down to Gera, or however you pronounce it, and he has the same concern Abraham. My wife Rebecca is very beautiful to look on. And again, we don't understand in our culture how women were treated. We talked about a few chapters back how even with Abraham and Sarah had her own tent, had her own dwelling. They kind of dwelt separately. They were considered very much so second-class citizens. They had very little control of where they went and what they did. Again, the idea of like anybody could have easily have lain with her, have slept with her. Women were they weren't treated correctly by any means, right? They were treated as very much second-class citizens. So Isaac makes up this lie, not an original lie, same lie that Abraham used, because it's again a part truth. She is a relative of his. You know, I forget what we say, like second cousin or something like that, something like that. So it's a partial truth, and he's trying to protect his own skin. How does Abimelech find out about it?
carrying on.
What they were acting good. Again, that whole separation, you would think, what did the King James says sporting with her. What does yours say? Laughing with her?
Mine says endearment.
So that they're kind of playing around with each other, right? In our culture, if you saw a man kind of joking around with a woman, would your thing automatically go to that's his wife? No, because our culture is different,
My
right?
Bible says caressing.
See, it could be that too. It could be that. It could have been sensual in nature. But even if it's not, even if it's just the sporting and joking around, women and men just didn't interact. And to see a man playing around, joking around with a woman, you would think, it has to be his wife. And if it's the other one, it definitely should be his wife, right? It definitely should be, right? So Abimelech sees this, happenstance through a window, and calls him in and goes, this has to be your wife. And does Isaac double down with his lie, or does he tell the truth at this point? He tells the truth. And again, why are you doing this? I thought y'all were going to kill me. So we always kind of chastise Abimelech, that nation, because they seem ungodly. But what did both Abimelechs do in Abraham's case and in Isaac's case here?
So they brought shame on their nation.
Yeah, the decree, right? With Abraham's case, it was even worse because he had actually taken her into his harem, but he hadn't slept with her yet. But all the wombs have been stopped because God could see it. And again, he talks about the universality of God's laws. The people didn't know about it. They didn't practice that, but they still felt the punishment for breaking that law. You think about divorce and remarriage, people talk about, it doesn't apply unless you're a Christian. Once you get baptized, you can wash it away. No, there are universal laws that God has that apply to everybody. Matter of fact, all God's laws are universal laws that apply to everybody. There's no special laws for the church or people who are Christians. So Isaac does this. Abimelech calls him in. Isaac confesses. And then Abimelech lays down the law. And what is the law that he gives to his people?
Don't touch him or her.
Don't touch him. Be put to death. And maybe he had heard the stories of what had happened with Abraham, right? With the wombs being stopped, and he didn't want that. Maybe he was more of a godly person, or they believed in God more so than what we would think in the idolatrous country that they were in. But anyway, he lays down the law that no one should touch him. Anything else in there? It seems to run in their family. Again, this makes, this is okay, get off subject. Flashing forward all the way to John's version of the gospel, right? Who's in the field meditating when it's Philip and Nathaniel? I'll give you the two names. I get them confused on which one is which. And comes to them and tells them, hey, we found the Christ. And you remember that whole scenario, what happens there? Where he's like, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And he goes, come and see. Which one is it? Which is it? I know it's Philip and Nathaniel. Which one's Philip? Philip goes to Nathaniel. So Nathaniel goes, can anything good? And then whenever Nathaniel's walking up to Jesus, Jesus looks at him and goes, here's an Israelite indeed in whom there is no guile. Now, I always confused words. I thought Jesus was calling out Nathaniel for saying, can anything good come out of Nazareth? But that's not the case, because guile does not describe what Nathaniel had said. Who do we know in the Old Testament that used guile or deceit in our context of kind of what we're studying about right now? Who's it going to be? Who used deceit?
Satan.
Huh?
Satan.
Satan. Well, in this context, I know, it's a stretch, right? It's going to be Jacob, right? Jacob and Esau's coming. How does Jacob use deceit? The birthright, where he goes in there with the hairy arms and the clothes of Esau to fool his, at the instruction of his brother. He's doing that to deceive his blind father. What does Jesus say to Nathaniel? Here comes an Israelite indeed in whom there is no guile. Nathaniel goes, whatever he said triggered something in his mind. He goes, how do you know me? He goes, man, when you were sitting under the fig tree, before Philip called you, I saw you. So that probably set Nathaniel back a little bit, right? Because that's where he was when he was called. He's like, what? And he goes, but remember what his response was to that? He goes, my Lord and my God. He confesses who he is. And Jesus is like, because I told you I saw you sitting under a fig tree, you call me God? He goes, you're going to see greater things than these. And he talks about the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. What is that a reference to in the Old Testament? Jacob's ladder, the vision Jacob saw. So put all that together. When he says, here's somebody, Nathaniel, in whom there is no guile, perhaps what was Nathaniel thinking about under that fig tree before he was called? Perhaps. Perhaps he was thinking about how could God use somebody like Jacob, who was so deceitful, to establish the promises of Christ coming. Contemplating that. Because otherwise, everything that Jesus said to him doesn't really make any sense, right? So when he's called and he shows up, Jesus goes, here's somebody in whom there is no guile. Because that's what he was thinking about. How can, about guile? My Lord and my God, you're reading my mind, right? He had the right interpretation or right response when someone reads your mind. This has to be God. The Pharisees didn't do that. Remember when Jesus answered their questions, they were thinking in their heart, who can forgive sins? Remember when they said that in their heart? And Jesus goes, are you worried about me saying, your sins are forgiven? Watch this. Stand up and walk. Did they believe? No. Should they have believed? Yeah, no doubt. There you go, my expression. Leave no doubt, right? There's no doubt at that point that Jesus is who he said he was. So Jesus says that to Nathaniel, in whom there is no guile, makes the reference to Jacob's ladder again tying into what he was thinking about when he was called, just to confirm who he was. Come all the way back here to, again, the idea of how does God use sinful and bad people to bring about his will. God's will not be stopped. It is going to come about. So regardless of how bad or good people might be, God's will be fulfilled. So it's our job to just try to do the best we can. That's a big rabbit. That was way off the beaten path. So we probably won't finish now, but we'll do the best we can. Any questions on that?
Good lessons on here. Different than what you're saying. Go back and look at Abraham and Sarah and talk about how pretty Sarah was. And then we see Isaac, his wife, is a very pretty woman also.
Yeah.
So the moral of the story is don't marry.
Don't marry a pretty woman. I was going to bring that up. I actually thought that, but I wasn't going to say it. Yeah, you marry a pretty woman, there's nothing but trouble. I'm kidding, of course, right? But if you think about things that run in their family, lying ran in their family, marrying beautiful women ran in their family. they had some things in common. Godliness hopefully ran in their family, that they obeyed God. And being blessed by God ran in their family. Someone read the rest of what Cody was supposed to read, 12 through 16.
And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds of many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped and filled with earth and all the wells that his father's servant had dug in the days of Abraham his father. And Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us, for you are much mightier than we.
Okay, so here's another life lesson. So verse 1 from Mr. Elam, don't marry a pretty woman. The second one, there is traps in this life by aspiring to riches. All kinds of traps. What happened when Isaac got wealthy?
We got powerful also.
Say again?
There's a lot of power. He became very powerful also.
He became very powerful. What happened? What was the result of that? Envy. The people around him envied him. Whenever the seed of envy is planted in any relationship, nothing but bad stuff follows. Here comes the problems. And envy can come about anyway. It doesn't have to be money, right? You think of this with favoritism between Jacob and Esau, we're going to see. There's going to be envy. Jacob's going to be the one that was chosen to be the leader. The elder was going to serve the younger. There's going to be envy. There's going to be problems. What was Esau's reaction when he saw what had happened to him once he figured it all out? What was he going to do? I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. Think about Cain and Abel. Whenever his sacrifice wasn't accepted, his countenance fell. What was he going to do? Envy. I'm going to kill him. The envious heart never looks inward and goes, I need to change some things about myself. It's always a poor reasoning of I'm going to lash out at the person I'm envious of. So it's going to create a problem. So much problems because it's what are these people, the Philistines, doing that's completely irrational? What are they doing because they're so envious of Isaac and Abraham, his father?
Filling all the wells.
Why in the world would people raising animals out in the desert start stopping up wells? Because they're out of their minds. You've lost yourself, right? It's not because it's beneficial to you, but have you ever seen that with people who just do things that are self-destructive when they're so messed up with envy and hatred and jealousy? Yeah, I have a brother, I won't give you the name. I have a brother, he would get so mad, he goes, I'm just not going to eat. As a parent, you're like, whatever, man. If you're going to be that, I mean, who is that hurting? That's only hurting you. But if that's what you want to do, more power to you, right? So again, it's an irrational hate. They're trying to stop Isaac, to erase the memory of Abraham and his greatness by filling up wells. Yeah, not the brightest. Anything else there?
Aren't we still in the middle of famine?
Right, the famine. That's what we started. Famine, like a food and water. Let's top up the wells. That's what we should do, right? Again, just bad decisions. Again. So what do? Watch yourself. Don't let envy get in your heart. Don't let jealousy, because then you're gonna look back at times of your life and you're like, ooh, those are bad decisions through there. You're gonna do that enough as it is, just trying to do the best you can. But you throw in irrational stuff like envy, hate, and jealousy, you're gonna make a whole host of bad decisions, and some might not be recoverable.
It's interesting if you go back and forth between Abraham and Abimelech and now Isaac and Abimelech. When Abraham was successful, Abimelech's like, hang out, stay here, don't move, wherever you want, we're gonna stay.
Yeah.
Good point. We're benefiting from that. Here, they're in a famine. He's had a very successful crop, and they're going to go away.
Go away.
Go to famine.
Yeah, again, irrational. Doesn't make any sense. You would think that someone you want to hang around, maybe you get some fringe benefits. Nothing else, maybe you can borrow some food from him, right? If you're all starving. But again, we want you to go away. And a lot of times people, they want people that make them look bad to go away. They don't want to try to do better themselves. The thing is, hey, why don't you go away? Hey, why don't you not work so hard? Hey, why don't you try to do this, right? I mean, I've even seen never me, but at work sites, people, you have one guy that's working like a dog, and everybody else kind of slacking. Do the other guys who are slacking want to step it up? No. They go tell them, hey, you're making us look bad. Slow it back down. That's just human nature, I guess. I don't know why, but that is. Let's read 17 through 25.
And Isaac departed thence and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar, and dwelt there. And Isaac digged again the wells of his father, wells of water, which they had digged in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. And he called their names after the names from which his father had called them. Isaac's servants digged in the valley, and found there was a well springing water. And the herdmen of Gerar did strive with Isaac's servants, saying, the water is ours. He called the name of the well Esek, contention because they strove with him. They digged another well and strove for that also, and he called the name Sitnah. And he removed from thence and digged another well, for that which they strove not. He called the name of it Rehoboth, and he said, for now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. And he went from there to Beersheba. One more.
Go to 25. Come on.
And the Lord appeared unto him the same night and said, I am God of Abraham thy father, fear not, for I am with thee, and will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. And he builded an altar there, and called upon the name of the Lord, pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants digged a well.
Okay. So, really quick, what's happening? They're going back redigging some wells, and what happens as soon as they redig them and get them flowing again? People show back up. Hey, this is ours. Really? So, again, Isaac is a mighty man, right? He has people. He has an army. What could he have done? He said, no, it's not. It had every right to do so, right? But what does he do?
Digs another well.
He just surrenders it, right? Moves on down the road, digs another well. What do the people do when he digs that well? this is ours. Thank you so much for finding it for us. Again, you would think after the first one, maybe you can understand the second one. That gets kind of aggravating. And you're like, no, I don't believe so. Well, what does he do? Gives it up, goes on down the road, digs a third well, and finally no one comes and lays claim to it. Does your Bible have in there what the names mean? We talk about names meaning things, what the names of the wells mean. Did y'all see those? Mine has brackets in there. The first one in verse 20, Esek, means contention, because they argued over the well. The second one in verse 21, Sitna, enmity. And then the one in verse 22, Rehoboth, means broad place, or God had given them room, a place to dwell, when they didn't fight for the third well. What else can we learn about that, about how we should interact with people, right? You consider the idea of meekness versus cowardice. Is Isaac showing meekness or cowardice here? Meekness. And what is, again, the word that gets misconstrued modern day, what is the definition for meekness?
They say it's weak.
Yep, it's synonymous with cowardice, right? That's a meek person. You're saying he's a coward. But what does meek mean biblically?
Strength with control.
Strength under control. The idea has a flavor of a bit in a horse's mouth, that big, powerful animal, but under control. Again, Isaac was a rich, powerful man. Could he have probably stomped these people on the ground to try to take this well?
Yeah.
Yes, he could have, but he didn't. That is meekness. He said, you can have it. He goes on down his way. Something that's very easy to say, but hard to emulate, especially when you're in the right. If you have the ability to force the rightness, if you will, but then to say, I won't let that go. That's tough to do. And I think here does it a couple of times.
I wonder if the people knew that about him, or because he's bound to have, or we were told he's got that reputation. People know he's a powerful man, and they know he's got people and armies and all that. So there's a certain amount of, I don't know if you say boldness, but for them to even come and say, no, that's ours.
Yeah.
They bound to know he can wipe them out if he wanted to. So I wonder if he had that, maybe that reputation of weakness as well, where they felt confident they could go and
Just take it.
reclaim what they felt was
Yeah.
was theirs to begin with.
It's a good thought, Rob, because we don't know. It's either, one, they were completely ignorant. Have you ever seen somebody messing with somebody else and you're like, ooh, if you knew who that person was, you wouldn't be doing that. They're going to hurt you really bad, you know? I've seen it before. So it could be just ignorance, or it could be maybe Isaac's reputation preceded himself, that he would just give in. Or maybe there's a famine. Maybe they were so desperate, they're like, we're going to die regardless. So we're going to go lay claim to this water. I don't know. We're not told. But again, the idea of this Isaac's character, again, he's not perfect. He has flaws. But here, he's showing restraint. He's showing some godly characteristics. I don't know how time is going to ring the bell. Where he digs the well, and he calls it Rehoboth. Where does he say he's at in verse, or where does he go to in verse 23? Beersheba, and he gets to see God there again. God talks with him, and he's going to build an altar there, and his servants are actually going to dig another well there. We're going to talk about Beersheba, but it's going to be later on in the chapter. It's going to be the latter part of it.
That's where Abraham was.
Yeah, Beersheba is a popular place. Actually, remember, I'll mention this as foreshadowing for next week. We won't remember. I actually won't be here. This will be for JT, going to teach next week. Do we remember why Beersheba is called Beersheba when Abraham had the meeting there with Abimelech? Because again, like kind of what Jess said, they come to him and said, you're a mighty man. We're going to talk about where there's some problems going. They were having some issues. And Abraham set out the 7 sheep. And Abimelech asked him, what are these sheep? Well, Beersheba at that time, we're told, means well of the 7. And then Beersheba here in verse 33, it's the well of the oath. When Abimelech comes to him and says, ask him to go away, Isaac to go away, he goes, I also want you to swear to us you'll never hurt us. They go through and have a big feast, and they separate and say, and so they call it Beersheba because it means the well of the oath. So Beersheba actually prominent place, but actually its name means two different things. Thank y'all for y'all's time.